Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Evolution Part 2.
Question: are all terrestrial biological life forms actually the result of a single common cell type, a primordial cell, which in science is called LUCA, last universal common ancestor? Answer:
This is only true to the extent that a single primordial cell was created first, which, however, enabled itself to multiply itself. In professional circles, the original cell is now called LUCA, which in English means last universal common ancestor, and translated means last common ancestor. This biological term LUCA, the Shining, was not yet known to me in 1945. Why, however, in the childish English language, last or last is said. Although LUCA was the very first ancestor out of which man finally developed, this is not comprehensible, but understandable, if one considers how primitive this language, among others, is compared to German and Swiss German. I will answer the question with a short explanation, which leads back to a conversation with Svath and myself, which we brought together in 1945. Edward. What would interest me would be something concerning how the emergence of life in the first origin has actually emerged from a scientific, chemical, biological, and physical point of view.
All very first primeval living beings or primeval microorganisms of every animate planet, as well as asteroids, comets, moon and meteors, etc., and logically also all large and gigantic life forms of every genus and species resulting from the basic primeval microorganisms originated from a first common primeval cell, which had developed from a preceding single primeval microcell in the form of an amino acid-originated primeval microorganism. This contained all central molecules of life, which are also maintained at all times, whereby the chemical reactions and the genetic code are the same in all kinds of life forms. However, how life came about in principle corresponds to a central question, which can only be answered by the fact that everything in its origin resulted from pure, natural, biological, chemical processes. Plausible answers to this question, which is important for people on Earth with regard to their conception of themselves and their worldview, have been sought in recent centuries by the natural sciences in particular, and have solved this mystery in its origin. However, no well-known findings concerning the origin of life have been gained to date, and consequently no plausible explanation has yet been provided for this. What has brought explanations, on the other hand, refers to the theory of the evolution of biological tribal history from lower to higher forms of life, as Charles Darwin, in his simple, elegant, and 100 times confirmed theory of evolution, is known to have brought. The reality explains, however, that today's diversity of living beings on Earth has developed in its origin through primordial microorganisms, which came to Earth through impacts of asteroids and comets and meteorites, as well as through gases and dust clouds drifting through space, which also reached the planet. So all life developed from a first primordial cell that multiplied itself. The offspring then developed further through repetitive small evolutionary processes of change in which those forms survived that best adapted to their environment and food and were able to live and reproduce. Even today, however, it is not yet known or clear to Earth scientists that a primordial cell created all life in its very first origin, and that this originated from a single cell that multiplied infinitely. How this primordial cell was created corresponded to a purely chemical, pre-biological development process. It was only through the development and existence of acidic substances that compounds arose, from which the first primordial microorganisms developed, which were transformed into primordial microorganisms through further combining and further training chemical biological processes, from which a first microprimordial cell was formed, with the property of a first form of self-replication. But before the people of Earth can now discuss the origin of life, which they have been trying to do for centuries and even since antiquity, but have not yet been able to form a rhyme for it, they must learn to define what has to be understood as life at all. Living matter, for example, trees, bacteria, animals, or humans, differs from abiotic matter, for example, minerals, water, and air, in that it can replicate itself. This requires, firstly, an information storage system or genome, and secondly, a metabolism, a biological chemical upset, or metabolism. This means that this minimal unit of life with which it exchanges substances is separated from its surroundings, which in all forms of life is done by a biomembrane that serves as a separating layer between different areas within a living cell, or between the interior of a cell and the outer space of the cell. This is where amino acids come into play, because without amino acids there would be no life, because they are the basis of all life, not only on Earth, but in the whole universe and in all its many dimensions. The many prebiotic chemical reactions in the urn fog have led to universe-wide biological life. How the amino acids first came into being is fundamentally based on the fact that gases and substances such as ammonia, methane, water, hydrogen, and other tiny molecules were formed in the universe's nebula and, above all, on universe objects or planets. In the interaction of atoms, electricity, that is to say, electric flashes, and a substance, which we call formality, as well as form solution, the first proto-amino acid, that is to say, a precursor form of amino acids, was formed. The formality, or form solution, is not only continuously formed under the influence of electric fields, but it is the substance which also favors and causes the formation of more complex organic molecules. And this substance is present everywhere in the universe, so also outside Earth, which means that amino acids are of absolutely natural origin and are not created by humans. From this, the development process continued and will continue endlessly, because electric fields adhere to the surface of minerals for all times of the existence of the universe, which are an important component in amino acid formation and which can continue to act endlessly. Amino acids were and are the absolute primordial cause and decisive for the beginning of life, because they form the important building blocks, proteins, which are indispensable for life. Proteins are therefore also the essential components of all cells in all forms of life, including protozoa, animals, plants, and humans.
Thank you very much for the transmission of the conversation between Svath and me, but I still have a question, namely, what is the substance called formality, or form solution by your father Svath in the actual sense, and whether our earthly scientists also know it. Unfortunately, at that time, Svath did not explain to me what is actually meant by this substance, and whether it is also discovered on Earth by the scientists.
It is actually known, and has been known for quite some time, because the formality or form solution is a composition of the so-called formamides, as they are called by an earthly technical term, but it concerns a certain group of formamides.
In the 1940s, however, Svath declared that it was not a monkey creature, but an archetype of very early human development, which could then be described with a clear conscience as a very early pre-human, namely as Homo ascensus primitivus, as it were, which I take the liberty of translating into German as primitive ascension man, or primitive climbing man. What do you think? I think how I express what your father Svath said in a Germanizing way.
In my opinion, it applies to how you translated my father's statement into German.
Contact Report 673.
The records of my father are based on precise clarifications, observations and findings of the events of that time and later, and on clear facts, and they state and prove unequivocally that Charles Darwin tried to prove his theory of evolution by unfair machinations, which, moreover, in their origin did not lead back to himself, but to a natural scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace, who sent Darwin a corresponding essay, the contents of which he used to his advantage. Wallace was on an expedition to the Southeast Asian archipelago at the time when Darwin was making a name for himself with the theory of evolution, when he sent Darwin an essay relating to his evolutionary research for study and evaluation. Darwin, however, used the content of his essay for himself and his theory of evolution without mentioning that the whole thing was based on the guiding principles of Alfred Russel Wallace. There was written evidence of this, but Darwin maliciously altered or destroyed it, or later misinterpreted it by reckless historians. But that doesn't matter to the Darwinists themselves in the face of evidence, but they use even more fraudulent methods to hold on to their Darwin truth. And the fact that Darwin fraudulently mounted a filed-up monkey jawbone on a human skull corresponds to an irrefutable fact that can be proven, because at least this fake Darwin product was preserved until the middle of the 20th century, before it was recognized as fraud under the name Piltdown Man. This is a human skull into which Darwin had inserted monkey bones that had been filed into shape. This human skull, forged by Darwin with his monkey bones cut to size and only about 6 centuries old, was to prove as a missing piece of Charles Darwin's theory that mankind should descend from monkey creatures. However, this skull was not the only forgery, because there were also various other bone elements that Darwin changed. The finding of the Piltdown skull was also based on a scam put into circulation by a man named Charles Dawson, which is why the skull was also called Dawson's skull and Dawson's Man of Dawn. Allegedly, so he justified his deception, he found the alleged remains of the early man or Piltdown Man in a gravel pit near the village Piltdown near Uckfield in the southeast of England, according to which the term Piltdown Man originated. Truthfully, however, Dawson did not find the skull, but buried it there himself, along with other pieces of bone worked by Darwin that were all manipulated bones from Darwin's estate, which he had acquired for a higher price from William Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's firstborn son. He knew about his father's forgeries, so after his death he wanted to get rid of all of Darwin's forgeries of fossils to protect his father's reputation so that he could not be accused of fraud. Basically, it was a completely confused, illogical and confused thinking and acting of William Erasmus Darwin, because he suffered from pathological states of fear, which were based on the fact that an uncovering and becoming public of the deception could come about. Instead of simply destroying or burying all of his father's fake bone pieces and the prepared skull with a filed monkey jaw, which would have corresponded to a logical action, he acted completely illogically in his confusion of fear and left everything for a fee to Charles Dawson, who was about 25 years younger than him and with whom he was acquainted. The deal between Darwin's son and Dawson was wisely kept secret, including the clause that Dawson would never talk about the true origin of the skull and bones. Dawson kept to this and never revealed the secret of the true origin of the skull and the bone parts, but distinguished himself as the finder of them. This alleged Piltdown man's skull was then, when Dawson made it public, presented for many years as significant proof of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, after which skull investigations in 1953 proved that the whole thing was a fraud and not a primordial fossil, but a fake assembled from human and monkey bones. Charles Dawson was mistakenly blamed for this fake, and is still blamed to some extent today, as were various other men, such as a paleontologist named Arthur Smith Woodward, who worked with Dawson but knew nothing of his fraudulent machinations and the acquisition of Charles Darwin's fake skull and bones. The writer Arthur Conan Doyle was also suspected of being the fraud and counterfeiter, but all these accusations were not true, for the only truth is that the whole fraud was attributed to Charles Darwin. But this fact is vehemently doubted and denied by inexperienced Darwinists, whereupon the Darwinian deception will continue to exist, and Darwinism will also be maintained because a faith that once developed can hardly, no longer at all, or only with great difficulty, be dissolved and corrected by the real reality and effective truth.
It is easier to believe than to think for oneself, to perceive reality in its actuality, and to recognize effective truth in it, to consider it, and to comprehend it through understanding and reason. And earthlings, who do not understand this, and who are also weak of intelligence and autocratic and defame their fellow human beings in this way, there are unfortunately enormously many, and especially those who can do this through public media are extremely mean. There is also a certain kind of scientist, by which I mean those heroes who claim that life originated only a few 100 million or about 1 to 2 billion years ago, because they have not yet been able to prove by fossil finds that life on Earth existed much earlier. Your father Svath already taught me in the early 1940s that minuscule life already existed more than 5 billion years ago on our planet, which is also much older. With his super magnifying devices, he also showed me super tiny fossils, which he explained he found on Earth and which were about 5 billion years old. Contrary to his explanations that Earth is little more than 5 billion and 600 million years old, earthly scientists claim that our planet is only 4.5 billion years old, which is why I always call this time when I write something about Earth, but which is not correct and sometimes makes me feel remorse. Many earthlings simply want to be big and make claims, assumptions or lies because they want to be more valid than their fellow human beings, or because they are blasé or crazy about size, to which, as I said, a certain kind of scientist belongs. Svath also said that every time a celestial body comes into being, tiny living beings or microbes are already present from the ground up. Depending on the genus, they could survive even in extreme heat and cold for thousands, even millions and even billions of years, as they have been floating undamaged through space since primeval times, but have emerged from planets and other bodies of space that carried water and other liquids. Apparently, the scientists do not know this, however, because according to various earthling scientific assertions, life on Earth did not come into being until long after it was created.
Contact Report 680.
At the primordial beginning of life, every life form consisted of a single cell, because each began its life as such. It was only through cell division that they became multicellular forms, And it was through cell division that the many special cells were produced from which the various bodies, creatures, and organisms developed. The cell is the smallest basic unit of a living being. All life forms, from the smallest to the largest, are made of cells. Cells are capable of making a copy of themselves, and some cells can even produce cell types that are different from themselves. Cells are therefore small and tiny, but there are also different forms and types that perform very different functions and can also move and crawl, even swim. Amino acids are the basis of all life on Earth. For the first time, these were created by relatively tiny organic molecules, which are actually compounds consisting mainly of carbon and hydrogen, and which also contain the amino group NH2 in addition to an acid group. Amino acids are omnipresent in the living free nature, whereby there are over 300 different amino acids in total. 20 of these amino acids are of special importance because they are proteinogenic amino acids respectively, amino acids in the narrow sense. Amino acids are the actual building blocks that are linked together in a predetermined order by chemical bonds in living organisms, thus creating larger molecules, namely peptides and proteins. The peptides and proteins differ in their chain length, the latter being shorter. The order of the linked amino acids forms the blueprint for a body, with these molecules providing the genetic material in the form of DNA and RNA, the ligaments, enzymes, skin and hair, as well as the organic bone material and the muscles and tendons, as well as many other components of the body are made up of proteins, which are made up of the 20 proteinogenic amino acids. Basically, they are among the most important organic compounds of all. In primeval times, the origin of life was electricity, and the substance did around. Electricity was created by electric lightning, which formed amino acids in a primeval soup of methane, ammonia, water, hydrogen, and other small molecules. Amino acids were created on the young Earth by lightning in the primeval soup of the Earth and set everything in motion in a decisive way, whereby the amino acids were decisive for the beginning of life because they served as building blocks for proteins. Proteins, in turn, are the essential components of all cells, starting with unicellular organisms, plants, amphibians, animals, insects, reptiles, mammals, birds, aquatic life, and human beings. In the very first origin, 5 molecules in the primeval soup were the decisive factors, namely H2O, that is to say water, ammonia respectively NH3, methane CH4, as well as carbon monoxide molecules respectively CO, and nitrogen molecules N2. This mixture of molecules was excited by the electric lightning charges, which was the important factor in the formation of the first amino acids. The original lightning and its generated electric fields were an extremely important component in the formation of amino acids, whereby these electric fields were also deposited on the surface of minerals, which has continued to happen since then and is still happening today, so that they will also occur on the surface of minerals in the future. In addition, many other prebiotic chemical reactions took place, which led to biological life, whereby deuteron played the central role in the influence of electric fields and an extremely important role because it was only this that promoted and enabled the formation of more complex organic molecules. The deuteron was therefore not only important on Earth for the development of single-cell structures and for the formation of amino acids, but everywhere on the worlds on which multicellular and material living beings developed.
Contact Report 683.
The other day there was a program on television concerning what we talked about some time ago, namely the actual origin of the emergence of the first cell-like life. You used the term "did around" as the actual origin. In that program, I do not know what the title was, because I did not see the beginning of it. They also talked about an origin of the formation of cells or something, and they used the term formamide.
This television program was recorded by Njana, following which I am familiar with it, and I can also confirm that the term formamide used is identical to the term didaraun that we use in our language for the whole thing.
Contact Report 711.
But first I want to tell you what you asked me a long time ago, namely what the Sonora Lake and the dwarf creatures were all about. As you said, I was able to find records about it in my father Svath's annals, which also revealed facts that were completely foreign to me and very interesting according to his annals. He explored the earth at many times in the past, and nearly 40,000 years ago he also came across Lake Sonora, where at that time the elevated terrain above the present center was inhabited by small-bodied human beings who averaged 115 centimeters in height and were the most distant descendants of the first terrestrial hominids. In addition to these small human beings, some of whose most distant descendants are still to be found in Africa as pygmies, as well as in Asia, my father Svath also researched their origins, which took him to many other areas of the earth, where he came across other various smaller groups of small human beings in Europe, Africa, South and North America, in Australia and Asia. These were all different, however, and ranged up to 160 centimeters in height, were differently pigmented, and also had anatomical differences. Interested, he continued his research into the past of Earth history and Earth humans and traced the developmental processes of hominids back to the early times of 17 million years. He then went back many more millions of years into the past and, around 45 million years ago in the area that is now Germany, came across first life forms that developed into a form in early times, from which the hominid evolution emerged around 17 million years ago, and from which, in the course of further millions of years, small-bodied human beings ultimately developed. He discovered these life forms at the place where he was also together with you, in order to teachingly instruct you where the actual original origin of the visible human life form began, in the area that you know as the Messel Pit, near Darmstadt. This first development of the life form, which led to the creation of the first hominid species, was found there for the very first time by my father Svath, from which, over many millions of years, the effective first human being emerged from the descendants that developed from it in what is now known as North Africa, as well as in areas that are now called Europe, South Africa, South and North America, Asia, and Australia. So he established that all the small human beings he researched arose at approximately the same time, all over the earth, and that they were the first and oldest human beings on earth, completely contrary to the false research results of today's earthly scientific anthropology, whose alleged knowledge is based only on incorrect and hypothetical or made-up assertions. Thus, it has been recognized by research in the past that the very first effective human beings on the Earth were small ones who emerged naturally in various areas from the planet and its nature, fauna and flora itself. So the origin of the Earth humanity was correctly found in Africa, as Earth anthropology teaches correctly, but not in the wise it was thought. Because early Earth human history did not begin at the time calculated according to the earliest remains of the genus Homo in Africa, but millions of years much earlier. According to the research of my father Svath, all findings on Earth concerning the earliest hominids correspond only to bones of human beings who evolved from the first genus Homo and thus from the first generation of the human species. As a result, the dwarfs, as you always call them, and because of which you have erected various artificial dwarf figures in the center, who were effectively the very first Earth-created human beings, gave rise to the taller, normal-bodied beings who populate the world today in vast excess. However, it must also be clearly explained that the hominid development of the human species did not take place uniformly, but in manifold temporal and spatial gradations. When the process of the actual becoming and the evolutionary adaptation of the Earth-human phenotypic anatomy in relation to the small stature of the first life form of Earth humans began about 17 million years ago. These were, however, human beings of normal height and therefore not comparable with the short stature or short stature of the short stature known on Earth today. This short stature is the result of various symptoms of different basic diseases, which impair the growth of the body and the development of the limbs, whereby it is misconceivedly assumed by innocent Earth humans that these short-statured human beings are cognitively handicapped. This, however, corresponds to an unparalleled error and misjudgment, for these human beings, impaired by dwarfism, are as a rule absolutely normal and equal to the so-called normal human beings with regard to the development of consciousness, intellect, reason and intelligence, and thus also to all cognitive and physical abilities, and thus also with regard to reproduction. Consequently, they are in no way inferior to the normal human beings in these respects.
Contact Report 713.
And this multiple mischief has already developed before primeval times, when in a natural way the life forms quarreled and fought over their food and mating, as has remained completely natural up to the present day in the world of free nature with the majority of many living beings. Only a few species of life forms, as a result of their innate, somewhat higher capacity for development, have arrived at modes of behavior by which they have deviated in a slight way from this law of nature and have become more peaceful, less envious of food, and less averse to quarreling and fighting. The early life forms, which in course of time ultimately evolved into the human form, were at early times quarreling, fighting, and violent among themselves in regard to food and mating in order to secure for themselves all that they needed. As the development of the human beings as a life form progressed, evolution also brought about the first important factors in the development of reason, whereby the fighting and struggling for food and mating could be carried out more and more successfully and efficiently. This is what happened with the early life forms that developed into Earth humans and will also be maintained by the present and all future generations of Earth humans. Consequently, they will, as at all times before, also act today, tomorrow and in the future as the laws of nature dictate, according to which they will also in the future always fight and struggle for their food and mating. If this becomes necessary for their self-preservation through any events, situations and occurrences, etc., but since they possess intellect, reason and intelligence, they apply these values and unvalues to their benefit, according to all their early experiences which are created in their inner character being and are also latently present today and tomorrow as malignant degenerations. The consequence is, and will always be, if Earth humans do not make an effort on their own, initiative to combat all these degenerations lurking in their inner character being and to dissolve them, that all degenerations and all evils of all kinds unworthy of human beings will go on endlessly into the future with coercion and malignant violence. And the most important reason for this is given by every delusion of every form, because every belief, be it in the form of a delusion of God, a philosophy, ideology, or worldview, which corresponds to a delusion of religion, is alien to every reality and truth. Consequently, every faith is not fundamentally grounded in the absolute certainty and irrefutability of factuality, truthfulness, and its real authenticity. The living beings of that time, which were still wild beings and not to be equated with ape beings, as Charles Darwin tried to prove as Earth-human ancestors through his fraudulent machinations by working on ape bones with a file, in the course of time fell into all conceivable degenerations, up to killing and murdering.
Contact Report 714.
We have already talked several times about why and where and in which of the different ages in the past your father Svath brought me, which you read about in his annals, and then ask me for details as a result of your interest. Therefore, we also spoke about the fact that I should mention something about it in one of our open conversations, precisely what Svath taught me about, so that facts concerning it would also be recorded and kept for later times. The reason for this is that if one day the Earthling scientists were to find important fossils and other proofs that everything was completely different from what they have all tried to prove for centuries, with absolutely false hypotheses as past history. One day, new and effectively doubtless research findings will also reveal Darwin's deception and prove that human beings on Earth are not descended from apes. Then I will only mention a little of what I have to say about the teachings of Svath, beginning with the fact that Earth humans did not originate in the south but in the north of Africa, which was already openly mentioned in one of our conversations. This is also contrary to all so-called scientific anthropological claims, or the science of human beings and their development, which also includes philosophical, biological, cultural, and forensic anthropology. Also that the human beings who allegedly originated somewhere in the interior of Africa, who in truth originated in an area near the Atlantic west coast in South Africa, somewhat later than the appearance of those first human beings who originated in North Africa, migrated from there to the east, which today is called the Orient or the Orient, as well as to the North or the Occident, as well as to Asia, etc. All this corresponds to a fairy tale, as does Darwin's fraud. His fraud, which he committed by filing monkey bones to prove that the human beings of the Earth descended from monkeys, which was unfortunately accepted and believed due to the stupidity of the scientists of the time, is still being defended today by countless ignorant people. This is in contrast to the fact that the Earth human being actually emerged from a creature that had nothing whatsoever to do with apes, as Svath showed me in the 1940s at the Messel pit as a fossilized fossil, from which the Earth human being then also developed in North Africa. However, we never openly talked about the fact that a human form also developed in Europe from the same species of life form that I saw as a fossil in the Messel pit. We never talked about this openly, just as I never talked about the fact that the small life form that I saw as a fossil was distributed worldwide in several species, and that human beings also developed from these species in various places on different continents, although they all differed anatomically in certain respects. All of them were quite small at first, and only grew into larger upright beings or human forms in the course of a long time, which then also spread in many countries in a sparse manner, and partly also mixed with Earth foreigners, as a result of which they also took over their genes. In particular, this resulted in such contacts and connections with Earth foreigners, which also gave rise to the modern humans, who were, however, quite barbaric and cannibalistic, and consequently did not always treat other human beings as their equals. Consequently, they also killed them as enemies, just as they imprisoned and slaughtered others, such as the Neanderthals in Europe and Eurasia, as living food stores when they needed them for food. These modern human beings arrived in Central Europe around 185,000 years ago, not the 45,000 to 50,000 years ago that our Earth scientists claim. So they settled in Europe earlier, even if no fossil finds have been discovered for this so far, and also no evidence that they had kept Neanderthals partly as prisoners in relation to emergency food during their first appearance in Europe, although they then later lived together somewhat peacefully with the dying Neanderthals throughout the region for several millennia.
Contact Report 716.
We have spoken before, which I will repeat here reading a basic repetition of Contact Report 714 statements. One day, new and effectively doubtless research findings will also reveal Darwin's deception and prove that human beings on Earth are not descended from apes. Then I will now mention only a little of what I have to say with regard to Svath's teachings, beginning with the fact that Earth humans did not originate in the south, but in the north of Africa, which has already been openly mentioned in one of our conversations. This is also contrary to all so-called scientific anthropological claims or the science of human beings and their development, which also includes philosophical, biological, cultural, and forensic anthropology. Also, that the first human beings are said to have emerged somewhere inland in southern Africa corresponds to a silly assumption and assertion, because in truth, the first human beings appeared in Africa in an area near the Atlantic west coast of South Africa, and at a somewhat later time than the appearance of those first human beings who emerged in North Africa in the area that today includes the Sahara and Egypt. The scientific assertions are fundamentally wrong that the early human beings who emerged in Africa from the evolution of mankind migrated from there to the east, which today is called the Orient or the Orient, as well as to the north or the west, the Occident, as well as to Asia, etc. These assertions also correspond to a scientific theory. These assertions are just as much a science fairy tale as Darwin's deception that human beings descended from apes. His fraud, which he committed by filing monkey bones to prove that the human beings of the earth descended from monkeys, was unfortunately accepted and believed due to the stupidity of the scientists of the time. And so it is also still today, since unasked by the stupid and those who want to know better, his deception continues to be believed as truth and is championed by countless ignorant people. This, however, while the human beings of the earth effectively emerged from a being whose actual origin began as a bacterium. And this was indeed the case, for the human being evolved from a bacterium into a human being, whereby the early evolution of becoming a human being and its coming to life on Earth is astonishingly old. As I learned from your father Svath in the 1940s, contrary to the claims of earthly scientists or planetologists, the Earth was not formed about 4.5 billion years ago, but already 5.5 billion years ago. So, from a geological point of view, the alleged findings of planetology regarding the formation of the Earth are wrong, because with about 5.5 billion years of planetology knowledge, the Earth is about 1 billion years older than is claimed. The fact is that the developing planet Earth was first an extremely hostile world body, did not yet have a solidified crust, and did not yet have water. In addition, this early Earth was hit by frequent meteorite impacts, which caused its mass to increase continuously, after which, however, when planetary cooling occurred, everything changed for the better about 4.5 billion years ago. Comets, asteroids, and meteorites transported water onto the slowly cooling surface of the planet, stimulating new processes, which in the course of time developed into a planet-wide water production. Svath taught me, but I will only explain this in brief, that the Earth began with its own water creation and created most of the water itself, namely when the first plants emerged from nature around 4.5 billion years ago, which developed, multiplied and stored cell sap in themselves by absorbing the sparse water in the Earth's soil, which was first brought to Earth by meteorites, asteroids, stardust, and comets from outer space. These waters were initially only sparse, but it was sufficient for the first biological life to develop in the interaction of all the necessary bacterial factors, namely in the form of molds, from which mosses and, in the course of time, also higher plants developed. The term higher plants, briefly explained, is to be understood as everything that fundamentally comprises the first genera, such as trees, shrubs, perennials, flowering herbs, ferns, flowers, and their subspecies and relatives. Mosses and green algae, I remember from Svath's teachings, are actually much more closely related to and associated with the higher plants than the immense diversity of the other lower plant world. Now, according to Svath's teachings, the waters, which have just been brought to Earth from outer space by meteorites, asteroids, stardust, and comets, first penetrated the Earth and were stored in it. On the one hand, small bodies of water were formed, and on the other hand, the small amounts of water that seeped into the Earth also created a slight moisture. This, however, was sufficient for the bacteria, some of which had been brought from the space of the world with the water, and some of which had also developed in the earthly soil, to come together in the course of a very long time and lead to the development of the first biological life. First slime forms, then molds, then mosses, and then the first lower plants, and then the higher plants. These were then followed by the first insects, and later the actual first fauna life forms that could move in water, in the soil, on the ground, as well as in the air, which were also followed after a very long time by the human beings. If everything is considered in detail that happened at the earliest times, then the following is to be said about the beginning of the emergence of the flora on Earth. A new process of development took place out of it, and this by the fact that everything developed exactly according to the creative naturally predetermined laws. And when the time had come for the environmental conditions to stabilize for the first time through liquid water, and for everything to occur, it did not take long for the first life to develop in places of soil and water, in the form of primitive single-celled bacteria, whereby Svath called this process early organic biogeochemistry, if I still remember it correctly. From this, over the course of billions and millions of years, life evolved on Earth from all primordial beginnings, and thus from its first emergence until today, as the entire complex ecosystems exist. But as far as Darwin's deception is concerned, it is to be said that the origin of human beings had nothing whatsoever to do with apes. For first the bacterium, from which the human being form finally developed over millions of years, lived as a fish-like aquatic creature, before it developed into a land creature and then into further land life forms, as Svath showed me in the 1940s at the Messel pit as a fossilized fossil, from which Earth humans also ultimately emerged, which first developed in North Africa. But we have never openly talked about the fact that a human form also developed in Europe from the same species of life form that I saw as a fossil in the Messel pit. In fact, human forms developed not only in North Africa, Europe and South Africa, but also in North America, Central America, and in several places in South America, as well as in Australia, New Zealand, and in various places in Asia, the Near East, and the Orient, as well as in the areas that are now called China and Russia, etc. A large part of these human forms developed in Europe. A large part of these human beings, however, died out again in the course of time, as a result of which their early existence was never known, which, according to your predictions, Ptah, is to change to some extent in the coming times, because small fossil finds are to be made for these facts one day. So far we have only talked about this among ourselves and not officially, just as I have also talked about the small life form that I saw as a fossil in the Messel pit, which was distributed worldwide in several species, and that human beings also developed from these species on various continents in various places, although they all differed anatomically in certain respects. All of them were quite small at first, and only grew into larger upright beings or human forms in the course of a long time, which then also spread in many countries in a sparse manner, and partly also mixed with Earth foreigners, as a result of which they also took over their genes. In particular, this resulted in such contacts and connections with Earth foreigners, which also gave rise to the modern humans, who were, however, quite barbaric and cannibalistic, and consequently did not always treat other human beings as their equals. Consequently, they also killed them as enemies, just as they imprisoned and slaughtered others, such as the Neanderthals in Europe and Eurasia, as living food stores when they needed them for food. These modern human beings arrived in Central Europe around 185,000 years ago, and not just 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, as our Earth scientists claim. So they settled in Europe earlier, even though no fossil finds or evidence of this have been discovered so far. Also, that they had partly kept Neanderthals as prisoners in relation to emergency food. This is unknown to earthly researchers and scientists, as well as that they then lived together in only small groups during their first appearance in Europe, whereby they then later, however, for some time in their regions still lived together somewhat peacefully with the Neanderthals who had died out, but who were not only to be found in Europe, but far and wide, and whose genes have been preserved in a few percentages in human beings up to the present day.
Our extensive and detailed annals, which we have also kept since the founding of the United States of America, cover completely all the armed conflicts from the beginning and all the warlike, intelligence, and terrorist activities of the USA in every respect. The original settlement by Europeans took place as early as 1430, when the indigenous peoples, the North American Indians, were still alone on the continent, who were then fought for centuries by European immigrants and their descendants, and finally almost exterminated. And this was already the case at that time, when between 1430 and 1500 there were about 72 million human beings living on the North American part of the continent who repeatedly feuded with each other as a result of territorial claims. The indigenous people were descended from their ancestors, the first human beings whom you also call primitive human beings. These had emerged naturally from this continent itself and therefore did not come from somewhere else, as the earth anthropologists, etc., assume and claim, because so far they have no idea and no proof that the original ancestors of the original inhabitants of this continent emerged from the planet in a natural evolutionary way, almost at the same time as all other Earth humans who emerged on all continents. So the original inhabitants of North America did not come 10,000 or 12,000 years ago, etc., from the present continent of Asia via a land connection where the Bering Strait is today.
Contact Report 721.
And the fact that we also brought this teaching to Earth at an early time was due to the fact that our ancestors discovered a natural dimensional gate 22 million years ago by chance, which is located here in the Dern universe about 120 light years beyond the Pleiades stars known to you. The dimensional gateway was discovered because a moon from our Ankar universe that had drifted from an exploded planet entered the Dern universe through this dimensional gateway, which our ancestors investigated and then found to be Earth's satellite. One consequence of this was that over the course of millions of years, small groups of Pleiaren repeatedly migrated to Earth and also died here. Later, when the first human life forms also developed on Earth around 12 million years ago in various areas that are now Europe, Africa, Asia, North and South America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China and Russia, as well as various islands, several small groups of our Pleiaren ancestors had also already settled in some areas on the planet, but they all died out in the course of the next millions of years. About 6 million years ago, when the distant descendants of the first human beings moved in a few specimens all over the Earth and had developed more highly over the next 3 million years, more Pleiaren emigrants came to Earth, some of whom joined forces with the original earthly humans and mated with them.
Nakademian worked out fundamental conventions or rules of social behavior for all life forms capable of consciousness, understanding, and reason, which also includes the human being, Homo sapiens, and all rational beings in general. These norms created by Nakademian regarding morality, ethics, ethos, and human rights, etc., were also brought to Earth about 22 million years ago, where, however, in the course of time and millions of years, they were no longer maintained, and therefore also not transferred to the earthly original human beings when they emerged almost simultaneously several times on all continents throughout the Earth about 12 million years ago. This is contrary to all the false paleontological claims of earthly researchers that human beings only emerged as dry-nosed primates to 4 million years ago in the south of Africa, and so on.
Contact Report 722.
In primeval times, the waters of the seas rose up to 80 meters higher above the land masses of the earth, which was usually mostly free of ice, and only rarely covered with ice during a certain early, progressive, temporary, and decisive stage. At that time, there were completely different temperatures, different climatic conditions, and equally different vegetative conditions on Earth, as well as different animal, beast, and insect, amphibian, and bird life forms, right up to the gigantic dinosaurs that inhabited the Earth world.
Contact Report 727.
I have already mentioned that the development of the really great diversity of species on Earth began significantly 77.2 million years ago, when an atmospheric fire caused a climate change that lasted 30.4 million years. During this time, all life continued unstoppably. Consequently, all life forms of all genera and species also developed in a completely natural way. Then, as I said, 46.8 million years ago, through another natural event, the actual very great process of transformation began with regard to all existing life forms of all kinds. From this also the first being emerged from many transformations, which for the first time had developed 5 toes on each foot and 5 fingers on each hand, which also walked alternately on all 4 limbs or only on the 2 hind legs, and from which then 12 million years ago the human being emerged. I am, of course, absolutely aware that the entire earthly paleontological science will deny everything that the human beings of the Earth ultimately developed from this being. Consequently, it is also claimed that another living being developed from it. But I do not care, because I rely on what Sfath explained when he took me to the Messel pit, showed me the fossil, and explained that he had personally checked everything to the last detail, and therefore knew without a doubt that the human beings of Earth had emerged from these beings.
Contact Report 731.
Viruses are not actually living organisms as such, but they are infectious, cell-less organic structures that exist everywhere in all universes, with a number known to us of around 2.7 million different species, and generally have the ability to replicate and evolve, with many also acting as hosts amongst themselves. Viruses are not self-sufficient living beings, but purely independent and autonomous structural forms. Yet in primeval times, they were the actual factors for the beginning of all life formation, whereby an innumerable mass changed through their evolution into life-first forms, from which the first lower life forms developed over eons of time, which, as a result of their evolutionary ability, grew into ever higher forms. This also included the many types of bacteria, which, as effective living beings, required a different basis than the viruses from whose transformation they emerged, for as life forms they required, for example, oxygen, sulfur, and other chemical substances, or light, etc.
Contact Report 750.
But now I would like to bury this subject and talk about what Darwin announced, namely that all life originated only from one single cell or microorganism and developed into all that exists. However, Sfath taught me, namely also by letting me see and learn the whole of the truth by means of his research technique, on a world developing its first basic life, that not only one single organism of a genus or species is the origin of the enormous diversity of all life on a planet. Also on Earth, the millionfold life did not develop from one single tiny cell, but, as Sfath taught me and also proved to me, first the most diverse virion particles, as they are actually called while they are still outside a cell, came into existence in masses. Only then, as Sfath taught, when a virion particle can infect a host cell, should it be called vir or virus.
Viruses were the true primordial origin of all life, which also makes it clear that the approximately 2.8 million viruses known to us pre-RN on Earth have not only negative, dangerous, and life-destroying impacts, but also positive, benign, and life-creating as well as life-sustaining ones.
Contact Report 776.
To lift the big ones to heaven and send the small ones to hell. The whole thing is handled according to the principle: let the big ones go, hang the little ones. This is also the case in so-called science, because those who know better than the learned scientists are disregarded and ridiculed. For example, it is still claimed today that the Earth was colonized from Africa because some types migrated early in Africa and went to the Far East, from where the world was then colonized, and the dark-skinned Africans changed their skin color and anatomical appearance. The fact that everything was completely different 45 million years ago, that the first life forms changed or evolved and were able to spread to all continents, from which human beings finally emerged, is not accepted because the knowers, the scientists, are of a different opinion and defend their hypotheses. And that human beings did not originate as apes or from beings of ape-like origin, despite Darwin's fraudulent claims and machinations, is also not accepted. Just as it is not accepted that in Europe, in the Messel pit in Germany, for example, the life form can be found as an ancient relic from which human beings originated. The Messel pit is a disused oil shale pit to the southeast of the district of the same name, which is located in Hesse, in the district of Darmstadt-Dieburg. The pit is well known due to the excellent quality of the fossils recovered there, which have been stored there since the Eocene, including the fossils that gave rise to human beings, which were still about 50 to 60 centimeters tall at the time of the Eocene, carried a tail, and already had 5 fingers and 5 toes. This animal of that time was spread all over the earth, and in the course of time, through its transformation evolution, gave rise to human beings in different forms, depending on its particular anatomical appearance, different species, and color. The islands and land plains, and even the continents of that time were connected with land bridges, so it was also possible for the life forms to migrate and leave their ancestral places and settle elsewhere. The fact that in the process human beings also emerged that were more than 3 meters tall, even small ones that only measured 80 or 90 centimeters in height, is something of which those in the know, the scientists, have no idea, preferring to rely on finds and fantasize their hypotheses about them, which only relate to the time that allows them to fathom the period of time when the dear critters lived, in terms of age, by means of the radiocarbon method of age determination.
Contact Report 782.
Furthermore, when the actual ancestors of the first human beings developed 12 million years ago, contrary to the confused assertions of earthly science and the falsifications of Darwin that the human being of the earth only developed 3 million years ago, then millions of years later, a descendant or a rebirth of the Nocademian found it necessary, when he saw all the misery that had arisen as a result of the religious and other beliefs of the earthlings, to take care of the well-being of the earthlings.
Contact Report 788.
Well, actually, Svath also explained to me that life probably originated on Earth in such a way that it developed on the shores of primordial waters, but in its original form, it came from outer space. The primordial substance for this, Svath explained, exists practically universe-wide in everything that moves in so-called world space. Comets and asteroids, etc., transport everything back and forth, drop it onto a planet, and thus make life possible, just as planets themselves do this from within themselves. As Svath explained, in the whole space of the world there is the primordial life, which consists of gases and electricity and various substances, etc. Consequently, life can develop from it everywhere if the corresponding cycles arise which are necessary. In this way, microbes and bacteria, etc., grow up over time, from which higher living beings develop over long periods of time. So in the beginning it is gases of various kinds, as well as electricity and climatic conditions and atmospheres and so on, that mix and create chemical compounds, from which eventually molecules develop, which themselves divide and multiply over time, from which bacteria develop over time, and from which in turn higher living things develop over development and time.
Contact Report 790.
The thing is, in the 1940s, when we were in Germany at the Messel pit, Svath explained to me that the human beings of Earth were never of chimpanzee origin, as Charles Darwin conjectured and also asserted to Svath, though he did not officially state his conjectural theory, namely that human beings were descended from apes, even though this is generally so asserted. I must say something more specific about this, namely what I learned from Svath, which is something different from what is generally told. Admittedly, I will therefore also be attacked without limits in this matter by Darwin theory fanatics, but especially by scientists who have sworn by the results of molecular biology and who represent their theory in this respect that they interpret them correctly, although they draw false conclusions from the technically correct results. But that is the way it is, and it will, as usual, also remain that way for centuries, until one day in the distant future the truth comes to light, when the progress of technology will allow us to effectively solve the mysteries of the past by making a return trip to their past reality possible. Until then, however, the Darwinian theory of evolution will be preserved and misinterpreted, especially because scientists see the results of molecular biology in the wrong wise and unfortunately falsely interpret them accordingly. And it will take a very, very long time before the truth of reality will come to light, if ever. According to Svath, he knew Darwin personally, the human being of the Earth developed from a completely different lineage, namely from a being that lived about 47 million years ago, and appeared, if I may say so, on all the continents of that time, but differed in its peculiarity of appearance and in its skin color, as well as in certain organs. It was an animal that had a long tail but already had 5 toes and 5 fingers. In the course of its evolution, the creature lost the tail, which regressed, which took millions of years, but in the course of time or evolution, the creature then developed into a tailless creature, from which the prehistoric man emerged. This was already explained to me by Svath in the 1940s, but it was also discussed with Ptah in the 727th Contact Conversation, and the following recording was included in the Contact Report, which I will add here again because it shows the being in its skeletal form. One must point out here the difference that the term theory has in science and in everyday language. In science, a theory means a representation of some aspect of reality. The more closely the theory corresponds to reality, the better the predictions of that very theory will be. In everyday language, we use the term theory, rather disparagingly for something still immature that does not have much to do with reality. In science, theories that have often grown over decades allow us to make far-reaching statements about the nature of our world. What I want to say, however, relates to what Svath found in the Messel pit in Germany and is estimated to be about 45 million years old. An identical fossil was also found by our researchers, of which this photo was taken. Also, according to Svath, the human beings of the Earth emerged from the natural evolution of living beings on the planet, not only in Africa, nor did they migrate northwards on the Earth, as earthly science claims, but human beings evolved on the various continents almost simultaneously, if we may call the periods of about 800,000 years almost simultaneously. There were clearly so-called primeval human beings of various sizes, namely giants who reached almost 4.50 meters, then the smallest who were not even a full 60 centimeters tall, while in between all sizes occurred. They all descended from creatures that existed in various similar forms about 45 million years ago, but which had been evolving worldwide for about 90 million years alongside the large ape creatures, and thus alongside what the Earthling called apes. Of these beings, the first species developed in the region of today's North Africa, where Egypt is today, for the first time as the original human being, after which the other first species developed where Russia and Asia are today, but also everywhere on Earth in many original countries. The first of these human beings appeared a little more than 16 million years ago. As Svath explained, that is, about 13 to 14 million years earlier than earthly science estimates today, and old skeletons have been found. And these primitive human beings were, according to our sense, human eaters, cannibals, who maintained themselves as such until a few tens of thousands of years ago, whereby they then also invented bloodthirsty gods, and then offered them human sacrifices and so on. But for thousands of years, they still ate their own kind, killing them in trades, sacrifices, and also in acts of hostility, which has been preserved to this day in individual cases, when the ancient manner of devouring human beings is still able to break through. I myself have seen and experienced that this is the case when, on the one hand, I traveled the world with Svath, and was also with correct man-eaters who killed and ate their enemies. On the other hand, I have seen and experienced that today's so-called civilized people slaughtered and ate their weakest in times of need, just as others in their need use the starving or those otherwise doomed to death as food. But even today it still happens now and then that human beings are killed and eaten when the old desire for it breaks through. Charles Darwin is also said to have manipulated old chimpanzee bones to prove his theory of evolution, Svath said at the time. Unfortunately, I do not know what he did and to what extent, but I do know from Svath's explanation that another forger later appeared, a certain Charles Dawson, who about 30 years after Darwin's death found the so-called Piltdown Man, the alleged early man, or his supposed fossil skull, which he in fact forged, as Darwin did with at least one of his finds, as Svath explained. In terms of evolutionary biology, the human being of the Earth is actually not a late bloomer among living beings, as is generally said by anthropologists, because they appeared at the latest about 90 million years ago, and then about 47 million years ago, as a precursor of the beings that eventually developed into human beings, but which had 5 fingers and 5 toes very early in their development. As precursors of the human beings, the apes and the actual ape beings, they developed the grasping tools, or the hands with 5 fingers, quite early. Of course, at that time the creatures were not given a human form, but an animal form, which in the course of millions of years developed into the human being, the earthling, which then developed into a human-like form for the first time 12 to 15 million years ago. So there can be no question of the human being having evolved late when the overall evolution of all living beings on the planet Earth is taken into account. If my intellect and my reason reach so far that I see and understand the very late correctly, as the anthropologists conceive it, then the emergence of Earth human beings is not to be considered very late, if one takes into account that the emergence of the first living beings is to be dated approx. 3.8 to 4 billion years ago. These living beings were still tiny at that time, and first had to develop over long periods of time into what we call animal forms, creatures, feathered creatures, other living creatures and the like, which changed again in the course of time, so that the old life forms passed away, changed, and new forms arose. And this has been the case since the beginning of life on Earth, as it is today and will also be in the future. Also, since time immemorial, many have become extinct because living conditions changed, or they were wiped out by human beings as a result of their thoughtlessness, self-importance, and irresponsibility. From a systematic point of view, the human being is a living being that has a spinal column that makes him or her more mobile in many ways. Much more mobile than the vertebrates and vertebrate animals in general, which, according to their genus or species, are far inferior to the spinal column being human beings, and are incapable of handling, doing and carrying out the same things as they are able to do because of their spinal system. This, although the ape beings have fundamentally more limbs than the human being, they are beings who have nothing to do with the human being, not even if certain ape species come close to the human being with their genetic makeup. Furthermore, it is given to the human being that, apart from their spinal column, They are capable of the conscious evolutionary development of the bodily movements, in contrast to the most diverse animals and creatures, which, as spinal column-bearing living beings, are hardly, or only to the smallest extent, capable of this in comparison to the human beings. They also have a conscious awareness, which enables them to develop logic, understanding, and reason, which allows them to act according to these high values. This includes, first and foremost, conscious thought and action, and thus also the invention, construction, and use of all that they are able to produce in logic, understanding, and reason. The human being as a living being capable of conscious logic, likewise conscious understanding and conscious reason, does not in any way belong to the class of spine-bearing mammals, nor to the order of the so-called apes, as they are wrongly called, such as the chimpanzee, dwarf chimpanzee bonobo, gibbon, gorilla, and orangutan. These are not at all related to human beings, the Homo sapiens, since their primordial origin, as the false doctrine of Charles Darwin claimed, and today's followers are also convinced of this Darwin theory, even though there is a high degree of hereditary equality. Thus, already 47 million years ago, the first forms of the human ancestors, and those of the genus and species chimpanzee, gorilla, and orangutan, were fundamentally different. Altogether, the ape creatures are grouped into about 350 species, and given the designation apes or primates as mammalian creatures. Subsequently, however, large and small apes are named, whereby the small ones belong to the family of gibbons living in Southeast Asia, and the large ones to the orangutans. In Africa, on the other hand, live the large so-called apes, the gorillas, and the chimpanzees, although these have nothing to do with humans or Homo sapiens, that is to say, they are neither relatives nor cousins of the human beings. The most striking feature of the human beings and the so-called apes is that they have no tail, and are usually larger and heavier than actual human beings, and also hold themselves upright as actual ape beings. The thorax of the human beings, as well as of the so-called apes, which are, so to speak, an intermediate evolution between the human beings and the apes, and consequently a separate and special species, is also much broader than that of the real apes. Another and very important feature is also to be noted in the apes, namely that their brains are much more complex and larger in relation to their bodies than in effective ape creatures. This requires a much longer developmental period, which means that pregnancy and the time until adulthood is much longer, as Fayath already explained to Charles Darwin, who, however, did not want to be taught, and accordingly even today, at least in this respect, anthropology is based on false assumptions. The original form of living beings, from which humans, apes, and all primates finally developed over many millions of years through natural evolution, goes back in its beginning to about 90 million years ago. That is to say that they already lived and developed at the time of the dinosaurs. In the course of evolution, however, more and more genera of living beings and their species also developed, with many dying out again, while others split up and again into new species. Darwin was not in a position in his time to provide evidence for his theories in the way that today's molecular biology techniques largely can, some of which provide indisputable and unequivocal evidence, such as that the genus chimpanzee shares around 98% of DNA and almost all genes in common with human beings. This, of course, tempts, even scientists, to assume that there is some connection between human beings and chimpanzees. However, from this, I mean from the 98% of the DNA and the genes, it is not possible to deduce that human beings are descended from chimpanzees and have the same or a similar evolutionary line. This is by no means the case, nor is the scientific theory that the early ancestors of the human beings and the chimpanzee could perhaps be cousins. Think of cousinship, for this, contrary to perhaps cousins, really has to do with a reality. In reality, it is not possible to deduce that humans and the apes really had common ancestors, from which chimpanzees and human beings then evolved. The family tree of the hominids is clear to independently thinking human beings, even before the invention of molecular biology technology, due to DNA homologies for real evidence that human beings are not descended from chimpanzees and are in no way cousin-like. Real natural science alone has had incontrovertible evidence in logic, reason, and rationality since time immemorial of human evolution that is different and different in behavior from that of the chimpanzees. This is contrary to the paleontological discoveries which, in the course of the 20th century, have repeatedly brought to light fossils that are assumed to be descended from common ancestors of human beings and chimpanzees. And since these all come from East Africa, it is erroneously assumed that this proves Darwin's thesis that the cradle of mankind lies in Africa. A theory, however, that does not point to reality, but is far from it, because the human being emerged almost simultaneously on the various continents of the Earth within 800,000 years. Moreover, the so-called apes, to which the chimpanzees also belong, were living beings from the beginning, forming their own intermediate form between the apes and human beings. Since the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, concerns have been raised again and again against the theory of evolution, although science always claims the opposite and wants to know everything better. Of course, there are always abstruse theses that go against the reality of real evolution and cause considerable confusion, especially among so-called experts. But the truth of evolution actually looks different from what Darwin's theory of the evolution of human beings, ape beings as well as the intermediate genus of the so-called apes claims, and still holds unjustified today. While the molecular evidence technology of today is far advanced, it cannot really see into the past and just what actually occurred at that time. In his 1859 work, Origin of Species, Darwin actually left the question of the origin of human beings unanswered. Indeed, he almost excluded it. But his theory left no doubt about what he really thought. He was well aware that his theory of evolution would provoke a dispute in the world that would last for centuries, namely his thesis, which he wisely kept in the background, that human beings descended from apes, as he also claimed to Svath. We humans share millions of years of evolution with the apes and human beings, but the ape creatures and the apes are not ancestors of us humans. Of course, evolution takes place over immensely long periods of time, which cannot be traced in all details today. But in human phylogeny, there is no ancestry between the human beings, the apes, and the ape-like creatures, or the apes. This is also evident from a large number of fossil species, which clearly prove this if correct research and neutral judgment were carried out, and thus not simply the Darwinian theory of evolution taken as a model again and again. Unfortunately, however, no further research is carried out, but, as usual, a theory is held on to once it has emerged, which often takes centuries, until solid evidence finally proves the opposite, or even the reality and its truth. So it is the same with a theory as with a religious or other belief. People believe in a dear God, God the Father, and God the Creator, in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, in Allah, or in Shiva, etc., until one day it is proven that it was all just a crazy fantasy and a belief in fantasy, but not the truth. The truth can easily be proved and understood with regard to the human being. The apes and human beings also in the coming time by means of fossil finds of prehistoric humans, because the more such finds are made, the clearer will one day be the realization for the natural development of the human being as a being who had nothing to do with ancestors who were apes and human beings. There is no doubt that the theory of evolution is only one theory, and that of a single human being, namely that of Charles Darwin. This, however, aims at a disdain for the human species that will remain until, after a long time, which may be centuries, the theory is finally replaced by the realization of the truth. It is true that theory has expanded our understanding of the cosmos like hardly any other scientific insight before it, for theory is and always will be an incentive to seek and find the truth after all. Theory was and is always the work of one or more human beings, but theories can and will lead to the truth through new findings, often only after generations. But one day they will be revised and made accessible to the truth, or they will come true and promote progress, that is to say, evolution or progress. Scientists, physicists, and simple human beings will work on the further development and improvement of all things, so that predictions and theories that are made will decades or centuries later prove to be wrong or correct with the latest equipment and methods, so that theories can be recognized as falsehoods, and thus the truth can be recognized, or other theories can be proved as fact. The same applies to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, whose scientific achievements and theories are in no way to be diminished, for he drew on ideas and theories of his time, and from these he finally developed his theory of evolution through his very own ideas, which the biologist Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck had devised, whose basic idea of heredity was, however, wrong. But Darwin recognized the correct mechanism of evolution by fathoming the interplay of mutation and selection. According to his insight, every living being has therefore developed its own strategies and adapted to the environment, through which it has been able to assert itself in its habitat and continues to do so into the future. Thus, some creatures evolved through their strength, others through their instinctive prudence, others through their enormous resilience or through their extraordinary reproductive capacity. This affected and still affects not only free-moving life forms, but also plant-bound life forms, that is to say, plants that are successfully represented in large numbers, even globally, and that reproduce only by impulse, instinct, or seed, because they do not possess an actual brain, as is the case with many free-moving life forms.
Contact Report 794.
If I say this about Russia, then I know from Sfath that the land area was already loosely inhabited by early humans in prehistoric times, and thus much earlier than the Paleolithic. This, however, is still unknown to archaeologists and paleontologists, etc., just as there are many other things they do not know or calculate at the wrong times, and also fantasize a lot of things together that do not correspond to reality. I can often only shake my head at this, because everything that is claimed is really quite different from what I have seen, experienced and witnessed together with Sfath on our, then many millennia later, so after the primeval times, when more and more human-like beings appeared, who never emigrated from Africa to the north, but effectively also arose in the north of the planet Earth through natural development, as everywhere in the world in a time of little more than 800,000 years, the actual early Earth humans arose, who slaughtered each other and used each other as food when foreigners met. This was their way of thinking and doing, just as the most diverse races with special characteristics, skin colors, sizes and looks, etc. arose worldwide, which moreover from the very beginning never had anything to do with apes or ape-like beings, and also never showed any kinship with such, but were an independent life form, contrary to Charles Darwin's deception. They were indeed primitive humans, and their entire habitus, their physical and physiognomic condition, their countenance, which is actually called the correct countenance, was still completely different from that of today's human beings. Also, the actual shape of the head was still symmetrically quite different from that of today's human beings. Everything about these early human beings was disproportionate, the whole body with arms, hands, and legs, as well as the head and its shape. Sfath went on to explain that millennia later, many of the human beings who would become inhabitants of the land, now called Russia, would be foreign immigrants from the various northern regions and from the south, mainly from the countries now called Norway and Sweden, Greece and Turkey. These immigrants, he said, will settle in the country and become indigenous, who will then be called Russians and the country Russia region, or simply Russia. So that was the normal course of development of the inhabitants of this vast country. Then, when the Neolithic period moved into this land, among other things, the so-called Bug-Dniester culture emerged, which was then followed, if I remember Sfath's explanations correctly, by the Sredni Stad culture. Then, as the transition to the Copper Age and the early Bronze Age followed, the region of the Kurgan culture emerged, which I still remember to some extent. What all came about then, and how Russia actually came into being, can certainly be read up on in history, if anyone is interested, because this is certainly described and states how and when it actually became the vast Russian area, to which Ukraine also belonged in the end.
Contact Report 815.
It was and is a lie what was told and is still told today that the early Earth-born human beings would have started fires with a so-called flint. In truth, they first took resin-rich tree branches and lit them on fires created by lightning. They carefully guarded these tree branch torches and carried them around with them, but they also tended fires in the caves they inhabited. For it was not the case that lightning struck all the time and started fires. To help these human beings, real Neanderthals, Svath took great pains to teach them how to make fire with flint. But the whole thing was very tedious, because first the correct stones had to be found. Flint stones, or so Svath called them. With one stone, a heap of material had to be cut off from another, so that when the stone was cut off again, one of the sparks would eventually fall into the heap of cut-off fine material, which was then placed in a clump of dry grass and blown on, causing it to smoke and then burn. But the whole thing was really very tedious, because some fine material had to be knocked off one of the stones, with another stone with up to 200 or 300 blows. This also always produced sparks, but in the end a spark settled in the pile that had been created, which was then taken and used to ignite a thin tuft of grass by blowing on it. It was really a very laborious method of making fire. Besides, I remember Svath saying that only a few rocks could be used, such as pyrite or marcasite, but only tiny particles were knocked off.
Contact Report 825 and note, the following excerpts are a correction or addendum to Contact Report 824.
I also think of the fact that it is still claimed today that the human beings of the Earth were born in Africa, after which they spread from there across the Earth, precisely because they emigrated and settled in the world. Anthropologists, etc., are still trying to prove that in early times human beings spread out over the vastness of the Earth with fins and ships. But this is only partially true, although they began to develop worldwide in the same genus, but in different species, around 12 million years ago, when there were still many fixed land connections between islands and large fixed areas. Since then, everything has changed enormously, and many of the islands and mainlands of that time have disappeared, while new ones have formed and are now inhabited by many earthlings, and large mainlands are called continents. Imaginatively, however, the majority of researchers who dig around in the Earth's soil and generally in everything old, etc., invent nothing but fantasy stories of how it is supposed to have been, and without really having any idea of how it really was. The believing Earthlings then take everything at face value and believe the bare, fanciful suppositions, just as they also believe all religious nonsense, and then they claim everything is truth, although little or nothing of what they have been told or supposedly handed down from time immemorial as truth corresponds to the truth.
Contact Report 829.
Back then, when the dinosaurs existed, it was largely natural events that led to the disappearance of the great living creatures. At that time, by the way, even if it is vehemently denied by the great scientists and mad know-it-alls and insulted as wild fantasy, there were also human beings who, however, were not born here on Earth, but who actually existed, as I once saw on a journey back into the past with Svath. Aha, so you are researching what all went on in your father's day.
Yes. Through that, I also found a fossilized excrement of a human being there, which is called coprolite on Earth. When I examined it closely, I was astonished to find that the excrement was 74 million years old. You have traveled together very far back in time, much further than only 25 million years ago.
Yes, that was very interesting for me, because that is how I learned a lot of things that had already happened at very early times, when no Earthlings had yet been created on Earth through evolution. And it is to be said that in those early times, many things, indeed many things, were quite different from what the all-knowing ones of today claim, precisely those who concern themselves with the past. So, I think I may now speak openly and say that beings from the depths of the space of this universe visited the Earth before there were Earthlings. Since then, however, their descendants have come here again and again. Whether the people who traveled far and wide were always persons of the same people, and also whether it was later their descendants who came here and who, I do not know. But it is to be assumed that the various groups were somehow connected. What is clear to me, however, is that some of the long-distance travelers rose up as gods, who were then worshipped by the Earthlings and to whom human sacrifices were also made. Some of them were real giants of different sizes, but there were also human beings of normal sizes, and then also dwarfs of normal size, thus not microsomic human beings. Microsomia refers to humans with abnormally small bodies. And there were also long-skulled and tall-skulled people, which was then imitated by the Earthlings by integrating the skulls of infants. Sfath explained that most of these long-distance travelers had mixed with the Earthlings all over the world, so that it would also be the case in the distant future that tall stature, long-skulledness, and tall-skulledness would be preserved, and that Earthlings of this kind would be born again and again if they traced back to the lineages of the mixing at that time. Unfortunately, such beings from the vastness of the material belt also brought various bacteria and viruses to Earth, which since then have been spreading worldwide from time to time and even causing health havoc.
Contact Report 831.
Otherwise, however, yesterday I came across, while reading the annals, that I may mention more than before that with regard to those who are simply called foreigners by us, I may openly say that my father Sfath and you observed them already in early times. In this respect, especially their ancestors on earth, how they have wrought and in some cases allowed themselves to be worshipped as gods. But they were of the same character as earth humans, good or evil, and thus beings who were friendly or unfriendly, helpful or exploitative, peaceful, aggressive, open, devious, and even warlike. All these deities, as Sfath, my father, writes in his annals, were of various shapes and sizes, but human beings who—
Yes, I know that. There were all kinds of shapes, but I did not see any like Asina, for example, reptile-like, as I call them. Note: see Contact Reports 90, 91, and 93 for information on Billy's first encounter with Asina. But at that time, there were also giants that were 3 meters and even taller, some up to 4 meters or so. But despite their size, the giants were somehow able to mate with Earthling women so that even today, the most distant offspring are still born, now as actual Earthlings who are 2 meters or 30 meters tall or more. Even small human beings, who are only 80 centimeter, 1 or 1.20 meters tall, etc., and thus are not dwarfed as a result of growth disorders, visited Sfath and I, and also remote descendants still exist in small groups in some places today, which I do not want to name openly, however.
This, as well as the coming into existence of the Earth humans, which is different from what is wrongly taught on the Earth, is the actual origin of the coming into existence, as well as the origin of various races which are not of Earth origin.
Contact Report 832.
That Darwin's theory of evolution is wrong, and a result of fraud is something I mentioned early on, but that it was a decisive extraterrestrial influence that really brought about the rapid early development of Earth humans is something I have actually only said and written about privately, just now. Also the thousands of languages of Earth humans, as well as the gods and their worship, and the religions and faiths arising from them, as well as the technologies by which many things were erected in ancient times, which would have been impossible by human beings' powers, were therefore not created by Earth humans alone, but by the knowledge and the energy and the capabilities which were from outside the Earth. The intelligentum of the Earthling also developed as rapidly as it did, not simply out of nothing, but also through other forces, which were not simply of earthly origin of development.
Contact Report 835.
But what do you want when earthly scientists are so lowly intelligent as to claim things that even a complete idiot must realize the imbecility of? This, how it is asserted that human beings originated in South Africa and migrated to the north, to Asia, etc., etc. And Earth's humanity believes this nonsense, and does not ask how it came about that suddenly white-skinned, yellow-skinned and red-skinned, as well as slit-eyed and otherwise completely different types of human beings arose from it. Even the climate, the vegetation, and the influences of the living conditions of millions of years were not able to bring about such transformations.
Contact Report 836.
It is also done by archaeology, as, for example, the finding in Latoli in East Africa is concealed, which can prove that a footprint of a modern human being was found, which belonged to a modern human being who already lived 3.7 million years ago. Also, an upper arm bone of a modern human being was found in Kanapoi, Kenya, which proves that this species of modern human being lived much earlier than the paleontologists admit, because they simply stick to the lying story of Darwin. Many of the earthlings are simply mendacious, live on lies and deceit, and earn a lot of money with it and gain reputation illegally, as also unjust people of politics, science, and profiteering, as well as the normal citizens. Thus, paleontology also largely conceals the fact that in the disused Messel pit in what is now Hesse near Darmstadt-Dieburg in Germany, where oil shale used to be extracted in open-cast mines, a fossil find was made of a prehistoric creature that lived 45 million years ago, and from which a species of prehistoric man developed over the next 5 million years. At that time, this primordial being was already spread all over the world, so after about 5 million years, in the course of time of about 500,000 to 700,000 years on the giant continents, a genus of primordial humans developed in many cases, which, however, died out again, whereby descendants, however, mixed with new genera. However, these were not the only ones, because after them, various other beings evolved over millions of years, from which genera of human beings developed, which, however, never had anything to do with actual ape beings, as Darwin told those who believed in this and in his filed fossils, and still stupidly believe in this deception today and think that Darwin was right with his fibs. Apart from the fact that aliens from other planets came here early on and managed to do many things that were not possible for the Earthlings, these were not Darwinites who falsified his assumptions, theories, and frauds by filing fossil finds, nor were they Neanderthals. This name can actually be traced back to the hymn writer Joachim Neumann, who wandered through the Dussel Valley and wrote his works under the pseudonym Neander, which is why the valley inhabitants simply called their valley Neanderthal, just as the human fossils, etc., that were found there were also called Neanderthal. This name quickly stuck and was then also used for other finds elsewhere. However, some used this to make themselves great and famous, but how publicity-hungry and bad, evil and misanthropic some great human beings really are, I experienced together with Svath with Darwin, who is so highly praised and lifted to heaven. He falsified bones, filed them into shape, and claimed that human beings had evolved from apes into human beings. What he said I never forget, and because I did not know Darwin's language, I had to wear the little translator that Svath had given me so that I could understand Darwin's speeches, as was also the case with others whose language I did not understand. Askit and your daughter Simya Se also gave me similar devices so that I could understand what was being said. But what Darwin said, that went deep into my memory at that time, because he explained to Svath and me his view concerning the human beings of the earth. I remember that very well, what he said in a completely misanthropic and anti-human way, which I cannot repeat verbatim, but in spirit. So I try to put what he said into words as follows. The weak, namely those who are handicapped in spirit as well as in body, and thus incapable of life, as he actually called such human beings, would quickly be eliminated among the savages and among the wild animals. Consequently, only those would remain alive who were natural ordinary and would show a state of vigorous health. The civilized human beings, however, he said, by which he presumably meant mainly himself, were doing everything possible to stop and cheat natural selection. By this, he meant the life-impaired and life-incapable, who should be stopped and eradicated from the ground up instead of being bred. He said that civilized human beings were interfering with the natural processes of the natural eradication of life, and that doctors were already being trained who would do anything to keep the unfit and unworthy of life alive, which would be practiced more and more intensively in the future. In the coming time, more and more places and houses would be built for the sick and the feeble-minded, for the crippled, the poor, and the lawbreakers, whereby the breeding of everything unfit for life and life-burdened would become inevitable. Thus it will come about that everything unworthy of life will be able to reproduce, which in the future will be of great harm to the race of human beings. In principle, human beings must act in the same way as animals, namely in such a way that what is life-impaired and life-incapable must be eradicated, so that such things cannot reproduce, whereby similar things cannot spread.
You, along with Ascot, have also found rudimentary stone tools that are more than 5 million years old, which
I left where we found them. They are probably much older than the paleontologists have discovered so far. They are lying anyway, because they have found things that are older than they have announced. This is simply concealed so as not to portray as incompetent, or likewise, those who have previously found something and claim that their assumptions correspond to the truth. But unfortunately, it is the case that the Earthlings are lied to and deceived through their teeth, and important information is concealed from them, so that the beams crack.
Contact Report 838.
Darwin, too, cultivated only an opinion and thus a personal view, which he was never able to prove, which is why he made falsifications in order to prove his truth.
Contact Report 840.
The different variations of Earthlings are due to the fact that not all of them are of earthly origin, as are not peculiarities that arise in them.
Contact Report 843.
Several 100 million years ago, the Sahara Desert had been a huge sea, and that the first living creatures on Earth had also developed there, namely on the shores and waters, as had also happened elsewhere on Earth. Moreover, the first giant creatures were not dinosaurs, but land-water creatures that lived both in the water and on the land, as is still the case today with hippos. The wild creatures of today were very small compared to those that lived in former times, as I actually saw with my own eyes. And the largest ones of that time that I could also see were, if I remember correctly, over 26 meters long, as Sfath said. Only many millions of years later came the dinosaurs, the sauropods, which were even bigger, in length as well as in height and thickness, and completely different from the creatures hundreds of millions of years before, which were long and slender. Sfath measured some of the sauropods, although I no longer know the size, but they were huge. But what I saw and experienced back then, I have never forgotten. Then, about 55 million years ago or so, the giant sea disappeared, dried up and became a desert, the one we call the Sahara today. There also followed a very long ice age, as well as a time when large jungles overgrew everything, as well as life forms developed, from which the first human beings developed in the course of millions of years through evolution, as was the case, for example, in the Messel pit in Germany, where Sfath and I found those skeletons of beings that were about 45 million years old, and from which, as Sfath explained, the very first beings emerged about 10 or 12 million years ago, which I will call primeval humans. Then, in the course of millions of years later, the animals and the creatures and other living beings changed into pure water dwellers, whereby their legs also atrophied, and fins were formed in various genera and species. Very distant descendants of these giants and colossi live today as whales in all the Earth's oceans, just as their earliest ancestors were also widespread throughout the Earth. And that everything really was different from today, even the continents and islands, I saw just as well as that the surfaces of the Earth really did change, and just as nations arose and disappeared again.
Contact Report 846.
Now, the age of the waters on the Earth. However, this is probably still the same question that has been asked by human beings since ancient times. What apparently does not want to be understood has been produced by this planet itself to a large extent, as is the case with practically every planet. Furthermore, I have learned from Svath that the waters were also brought to Earth from SOL space by comets, asteroids, meteors, as well as ice clouds, of which our astronomers etc. still know nothing. It should be said, however, that the first waters developed independently and completely naturally from the planet itself, as a result of the gluten and heat of the emerging world body. Heat and warmth led to the evaporation of the developing heat gases, which entered the empty space of the developing world body in gaseous form and formed the very first atmosphere, that is to say, a gas atmosphere. Further geological processes took place over a long period of time with regard to new evolutionary and beneficial changes, so that everything continued to change, and an atmosphere and hydrogen developed over billions of years, as did plants and thus also oxygen, which combined with hydrogen, and further also life, which could move independently, etc., as I learned from Svath. Even almost 4 kilometers into the depths of the Earth, I have detected life together with Svath. This is still untouched by the Earthling, but the question is, for how much longer?
Contact Report 864.
1949.
Here on Earth, the genus human being exists only once, while the genera of natural beings are millions of them, and are divided into species that develop in certain wise through mutations from the genera. Overall, the genera of life forms are actually called races, while the species that are actually mutations and in this respect emerge from the genera are called half-castes or crossbreeds, because they have different parents from different races that can mate with each other. This is precisely when this is naturally possible, because otherwise this would not be feasible, because genera are normally separated from each other throughout in such a way that sexual union for the production of offspring is not possible if this were not conceivable as a result of a natural anomaly.